So a while back, I had the privilege of helping some friends of mine with a funeral service for their father. Afterwards, I was having a conversation with Werner in his apartment when he still lived with us about specifically what I had to say with regards to the status of the deceased. It was one of a series of conversations we had had because he was just endlessly fascinated by the fact that although the pain of Elsie's loss never really diminished for him, also that sense of connection that he had with her never really lessened. And we spoke a number of times about his new understanding of what it meant that the two shall become one flesh. So my response to him was, I had first of all celebrated with the congregation the fact that I no longer felt it was necessary to convince the family that was left that the deceased had done something or said something or prayed something or believed something or had something done to him so he went to heaven. And how glad I was that I was able to dispense, along with many of my colleagues in my faith community, with this fear-based religion that we had grown up with, and just were able to get on with the business of asking, how did we live our lives like Jesus? Which there was much to celebrate. And then I mentioned something about possibility that some fundamentalist friends of mine might have some exception to that understanding, and Werner looked at me and he said, "Brad, you're not accusing me of being a fundamentalist, are you?" Which of course I was not, because Werner and I both had come to some very different understandings about this and other doctrines that we used to preach as being fundamental to embrace in order for God to embrace us. Truth be told, we have read many books together and discussed them and had conversations, the gist of which, if we had attempted to preach them in any of the churches we pastored, would probably have landed us on the sidewalk before the postlude ended. I recall one of the final services that I helped Werner to attend at the faith community which he had chosen as his final spiritual home. At that service, they installed their new pastor, and I thought that she was very competent, quite personable. Her partner was also there, and I thought that she as well was a lovely person. And on the way home, Werner and I ruminated together about there being a time when that situation would have resulted in some amount of theological consternation for both of us. All of which is to say, I think it is related to the first of two things that Werner specifically asked me with regards to this event. First of all, he requested that if anybody had something to say about anything at his funeral, that it be about the grace and the mercy of God. I get that. Living in a world saturated and suffused by God's love and grace and mercy is always something to celebrate. At the same time, I think that also reflected a certain amount of growth that he had in his own theological understanding versus what he grew up with, in thinking that the grace of God was some sort of an inoculation against the disease of being human, somehow tainted by original sin. It was those kind of doctrines that had come to be biblically suspect for him and truly at odds with the nature of the divine as he had come to experience that. The other thing he asked, perhaps ironically, is that nobody speak of him as having been a good person. I think that's certainly related to a reluctance on his part to be put up on some sort of spiritual pedestal. But I also think with regards to that, it's related to the way that he had come to think differently than the worldview he had grown up with, which is basically designed to split reality into categories like good and bad, righteous, unrighteous, who's in, who's out, sacred, secular. He really started to see salvation itself as less of an individual transaction and more of a communal process that we enter into, which hopefully over time makes more and more clear the reflection of God in this world. In the world of wellness, when we speak of aging, we sometimes speak of neuroplasticity, this ability that the brain has to create new connections, even grow new brain cells right up to the end. I saw some of that in Werner, but I also saw what I would call a theoplasticity, this ability he had to evolve and mature and change over time in response to new understandings of Scripture and the nature of the divine as he engaged with those conversations. It's a rare thing in my experience. I've been told that a complete spiritual journey could have 4 components: moving from disbelief to dogma, to questioning that dogma, to finally just not needing all the answers to those questions and being able to turn back and embrace that about your tradition which you find to be life-affirming. And I saw that kind of a journey in Werner. And I believe that if he could make a call yet today, he would make it to the church, that which he dearly loved to the end, and yet was deeply concerned about, as he saw it is still being largely mired in phase 2. I believe he would call the church to reassess, reevaluate, and re-embrace that about the tradition which is life-affirming in order to continue to play its role in God's redemptive plan for this world. I know all of this because I went through it with Werner 3 years ago next month. But Werner's voice is silent now. And I think in a time of great change and uncertainty for the church that is a grievous loss. And it's a grievous loss to me. I see no path forward to actually be able to replace those kind of conversations. Something that I came to think of as one of the last tenuous tendrils that might still have had the capacity to draw me along on the 4th stage of my own journey. But you can only experience great loss if for a season you've enjoyed great gain. So rest in peace, Werner, and rest assured, you will be missed.